Welcome back to Union Voices, the MEU Berlin podcast. I am your host Tabea, and today we will explore the future of European governance, a timely and crucial topic as the European Union navigates political, social and economic shifts. We are joined by Professor Mark Dawson, a professor at the Hertie School and Co-Director of the Jacques Delors Centre. With his expertise in European Union governance, he will share insights on the challenges and opportunities facing Europe today, how the European Union is adapting to change, and also the role of young policymakers in shaping tomorrow's Europe. A warm welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for making the time, and thank you in advance also for sharing your insights with us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you. We're very honored to have you on our podcast. Maybe to start this conversation, would you give us a quick rundown of your career, maybe introduce yourself a little?
Yeah, sure. So originally I'm from the UK. I'm Scottish actually, but so I was trained as a lawyer. I did a law degree at the University of Edinburgh, but I left the UK a long time ago now, I think in 2005. I went and did my PhD at the European University Institute, which is a kind of the EU's graduate institute in Florence. And I did my PhD again in law, but more in kind of the law of the European Union. And I've not been back to the UK since. So I guess I'm one of those who took advantage of the opportunities that people in Britain had in the European Union while we were still in the European Union.
Yeah.
And then after finishing my PhD, I went to work in the Netherlands. I was an assistant professor of European law at the University of Maastricht, which is a place where many young people go to do European studies and European law, for example. And then since 2012, I've been at the Hertie School of Governance, which is a school of public policy in Germany, in Berlin. And those among you in this audience who know Berlin a little bit and the kind of educational scene in Berlin might know Hertie. So we train master students mainly, but also PhDs and executive students in public policy. We do have a Master of Public Policy and a Master of International Affairs, as well as one of Data Science. So I mainly teach courses that relate either to the EU or that relate to law and legal issues at the Hertie School, and I've been doing that since 2012. And then the last thing is that also you mentioned Tabea in the introduction, and for the last year I've also been the co-director of the Jacques Delors Centre, which is a centre for European affairs at the Hertie School, which combines research on Europe with think tank work. So we do a lot of policy-related work on current issues in European integration, trying to really get the conversation in Germany going on European issues and trying to nudge the German government to be being more active on European issues. So this is the very brief rundown of what I've been doing.
Okay, great. Thank you. So you've mentioned already what you do at Hertie School and also at the Jacques Delors Centre. How can we imagine your work? Is it very challenging? Is it how does it look like?
I think it's a really interesting job. I consider myself very lucky because I'm always with young people. So obviously a big part of my job is that I'm teaching. So I teach lots of different really talented young students who come from all over the world. So our student body is more or less a third, maybe maximum 40% of them our students are from Germany. But the rest of our students are from lots of different parts of the world, from Latin America, from India, from other parts of Europe, and from the United States. So a lot of my day-to-day life is kind of getting them engaged in learning about the EU or learning about legal issues, learning about constitutional law, for example. So I think that's something really exciting. So a lot of my day-to-day job is devoted to teaching and also supervising, because the students, they write a master's thesis. I have a number of PhD students. So that's a really big part of my life. But another part of it is more kind of research oriented. So I conduct research in the area of EU law. So a lot of that can sound quite boring. A lot of it is being, sitting at your desk and reading a lot, reading about new developments, new cases coming out of the European Court of Justice, new pieces of legislation, and thinking about what's changing in the EU and how should we understand it. But I'm lucky that because I'm at the Jacques Delors Centre, I have a lot of really interesting colleagues. So a lot of the work that I do is really collaborative. I often team up with co-authors. I often write things together with postdoctoral researchers or PhD researchers. I work together often with colleagues in other disciplines. So we do a lot of interdisciplinary research together between lawyers and political scientists, for example. So it's not too lonely. There's a lot of collaboration in the research part as well.
Yeah. I think that's something that can be said for research in general, that you do need to do a lot of collaborative effort to get something done sometimes. So you mentioned you were from the UK, you're Scottish, and then you came to the mainland Europe, so to speak, in 2005. What made you so interested in European governance, in the European Union, in policies in the first place, that you decided to then intensify your studies, your research, your career in that direction?
I think part of it is maybe if you're from Scotland, for example, there's a slightly different attitude towards Europe than the rest of the UK. So historically, Scotland's always been very connected to other European countries, and I think Scottish people tend to have quite a sort of layered identity, so they're used to being kind of Scottish and British and therefore European as well. So I was always interested in learning about other European cultures and curious about what it'd be like to live in Europe. What Scotland also has, like from a legal perspective, it's got a very layered legal order, for example. So it always had its own legal system, but it was also part of the UK. So it had the influence, obviously, of the English legal system. So that meant it's kind of a multi-level system whereby different types of legal and political order have to interact and they influence each other. So it wasn't that much of a leap to thinking about, well, what does it therefore mean to be part of a European system that's also interacting with these national systems? So I think I was interested in how law and legal institutions and rules, they change and they adapt once you shift them from this kind of national context into a European context. But like I think a lot of careers, a lot of it was simply by accident. So I didn't really go to Florence or the EUI because I was interested in the European Union. But once I got there, and once I was around people from other European countries, and I was around really interesting professors who were engaged in that topic, I kind of became engaged in it as well. So it wasn't necessarily by design, it was more a product of the environment and the people that I was meeting.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. I think that's how it happens a lot of the time. You've been in this field for a long time now. And since we said the topic today would be European governance, what do you see as the biggest challenges we're facing today in that field?
It's very complex to answer that question because there used to be a time where Europe did a certain limited number of things and the nation states did the rest. So when you were thinking about the set of challenges that the EU faced, they were kind of a different set of challenges and a more narrow set of challenges than the challenges you would face in Germany or France or one of the member states. But now, it's almost impossible to distinguish Europe's challenges from the challenges of its states, right? And in a way, Europe has been given the problems that the nation states can't solve. So the nation states don't know how to tackle climate change. They don't know how to develop a method of reducing emissions effectively across borders. Or the nation states don't know how to support Ukraine and provide collective security. So they're not capable of solving these problems. So they therefore give the EU the task of solving these problems. But of course, the very reason that the nation state can't solve these problems is because they're hard to solve. They don't invite very easy answers. So I think that the challenges that the EU faces are incredibly broad, and they spill over into basically each and every major field of national policy. But at the same time, the EU has to solve these problems in a quite difficult governance and decision-making framework. So the core challenge as I see it is being able to make this framework effective in order to meet the different policy goals that the EU kind of has for itself, which is a lot kind of easier said than done. So there is a lot of more consensus than we think about many of these public policy problems, right? I mean, there are, of course, there's political disagreements, but we all know, for example, that if we want to meet the gap in competitiveness between Europe and the United States, we need a significant period of structural investment in Europe where we invest in reforming and digitalizing our economies and improving the skills gap between Europe and other parts of the world. So we all know kind of that there are certain things that need to be done, but it's very hard to create a framework that can allow these changes to be operationalized at the European level. So sort of making sure that the EU is kind of fit, that it can actually achieve the task that the member states continue to give it. That's kind of one of the major problems that it's facing at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. With these frameworks you've been talking about that the EU has to establish for the member states, I imagine it's also hard to create frameworks that will then be fitting for all the member states, because if something like that is supposed to work in the long run, then you will need every member state to be in on that, right? And for that to work, the frameworks will have to fit every kind of system, every kind of background these different member states might have. I imagine that is quite hard to actually do.
It's very hard. So we see that. I think that the traditional idea has often been that we give the EU some kind of power in order to create collective decisions. And once it creates a decision, it can be implemented in the member states, and the member states will gradually be able to accommodate it. They'll be able to implement it in their own legal systems. But what we've kind of found out is that there are underlying divergences between the national systems that are very robust, and they don't go away. They're still there. Mm-hmm. Even after decades of trying to make member states more ready for European integration. So then you might argue that the Eurozone, for example, is a case of that, right? So we still have massive differences in living standards, in wages, massive differences in the way in which the economy is designed between different constituent parts of the EU. And it's not clear that by establishing something like the euro, we eliminated these differences. So it's not just a matter of establishing a set of rules, and those rules will gradually lead to differences between member states being eliminated. Those differences kind of persist, right? And we have to somehow find a way of dealing with them and accommodating them in policy making. And now we're facing that same problem in other areas of policy. So no longer just in economic integration, but we're facing that same problem in things like energy policy, or we're facing it in security policy. How do we deal with these differences? Both structural, the way in which we deliver policy, but also in preferences of what kind of policies the different member states and Europeans actually want. This seems to be being challenged in a number of countries, including Austria most recently.
Yes. Yes. If you're speaking about that already, how does one, or how does the EU, how do you go about that? How do you try to overcome these difficulties? How do you go about convincing member states to actually implement the things, to actually see the benefit of those?
I think, a successful model of European integration, it is not just about the relationship between a set of European institutions like the European Commission and national governments, right? It's also about mobilizing at other levels. So, for example, encouraging, civil society groups, for example, or citizens to become allies, essentially, with European institutions in creating societal mobilization and societal pressure for certain types of policies or for working together at a European level. So I think that's kind of one thing to keep in mind, sort of when we think about the rise of populist parties, for example. We think that, well, because Hungary has government X or Austria has government Y, they're an obstacle to European integration. But interestingly, if you look at sort of the populations within those states, look at the population of Hungary or the population of Poland, for example, when the Law and Justice Party was ruling in Poland, the attitude of the population towards European integration, and certainly to certain issues and policy proposals, was quite different from the attitude of the government, right? So the underlying support for European integration might be actually stronger than kind of looking just at the level of governments. At the same time, obviously, European institutions have to learn to live with a different type of environment, an environment whereby there are actors participating in institutions who don't share the same vision of what those institutions should be doing as in the past, with this kind of greater dissensus than there has been in the past. But that is a new normal. That's not going to go away. Sort of populist governments are going to be part of European decision making. So European decision making has to somehow learn to accommodate them, and it has to somehow learn to convince and demonstrate to those governments that they can deliver for them, actually. That sort of it's in their interest to participate in European decision making rather than to exit the EU or to try and advocate for the disintegration of the European project. So, in a way, Europe has to live with the choices that citizens make at the national level and has to find a way of kind of nonetheless moving the process forward.
Yeah. That is a very insightful answer. Thank you. If we're going off of that, as in keeping the decisions the citizens made in mind and still going forward, that obviously, as we have stated multiple times already, makes it extremely complex to actually move forward with the different topics, the different problems the EU is trying to tackle. And still it works somehow. Still there always is a new policy there. There is something new that was established. There is a way forward. How do you think this success in actually achieving the things, even though there is a lot of challenges, how do you think that comes to be?
Well, I think it's it's often the case, just think about the way national systems work. There are always going to be actors that oppose certain policies, right? Often this can be business interests, for example, or certain civil society actors. There's always going to be actors within the system who oppose certain reforms, but at the same time, they might be in favor of other reforms. And therefore, if you have a government that's trying to implement a whole series of policies, it's often the case that those who are opposed to a certain series of policies might reluctantly agree to them because they're combined with other policies that they like. And I think that's also the way institutions like the Council work. So there are a lot of nation states that are opposed to a lot of the climate agenda, for example, or the European Commission, or they think maybe it's going too far, or they think that particular sectors of their industry will be harmed. But at the same time, they know that there's a majority political support for it. So therefore, they try to influence at the edges. You know, they try to water things down, or they try to trade things. So I'll agree to certain emission standards for vehicles, for example, but in return, maybe I want the Commission, for example, to take a more lenient approach towards subsidies that I as a state want to introduce to support a certain sector of the economy. So there's a lot of kind of deals going on, and I think those deals kind of allow integration to proceed. But at the same time, that kind of deal-making process, it conflicts with something else because it produces a certain problem of intransparency or a certain problem of citizens actually understanding what's going on in EU governance, or it kind of establishes a feeling that it's a bit of a dirty business, right, that's happening in Brussels, and it's not very transparent. So that the kind of compromises that are needed in order for, as you said, some policy making at the transnational level to be successful and to emerge, also is part of what kind of creates this perception among citizens that the EU decision-making process is not open enough or not connected to citizens enough.
How do you think this process could be made more transparent?
Well, I'm not sure if a certain type of transparency is necessarily the answer, right? So one of the things, if you look at political science research on the Council, is that one of the reforms that was made several years ago was that they started televising, for example, meetings of the Council. So when the ministers of the different governments got together to negotiate European legislation and negotiate rules, that would be done at the open. Now that sounds good, right? It sounds like, that means people can see what's going on. But of course, the effect of that was that these meetings have become extremely boring. No one says anything at them. They simply rubber stamp. And the reason they're like that is because the real meetings are happening elsewhere, right? So the ministers and their subordinates agree and negotiate things in advance, and then in the actual Council meetings, they just rubber stamp what they've already agreed. They don't actually discuss things openly. So there's a certain paradox there, right? A degree of intransparency is needed in order to have kind of proper deliberation. So I'm not sure if that type of transparency, which is just making everything open for people to see, is important. But there are other types of transparency that are important. So one thing that's important, for example, is that there needs to be media scrutiny of what's happening in Brussels, right? There needs to be journalists, for example, who are asking questions, journalists who are pointing out when there are conflicts of interest or where member states are doing things that are clearly not in the interest of their citizens. And that's also often a big problem in Brussels. It's a problem because a lot of our national newspapers are national, right? They're more connected to the national policy space than they are to the Brussels policy space. So I think when we think about transparency and accountability of EU governance, empowering those intermediaries like journalists, for example, that probably is more important than doing things like having a live feed of a parliamentary hearing that no one will watch because no one's interested in it. So I think we have to think about the practical ways we can make EU decision making more accountable.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. So, changing a little now, we also wanted to talk about the future of governance in the European Union, especially how to shape a future European Union, how to go about that, who is needed, what skills are needed. What are your thoughts on that?
So do you mean by that kind of what types of leaders do we need, or what types of young people do we need to shape?
First of all, that, and also how the future might look like.
Yeah. So the second part is a lot harder. So I think one thing that's really clear is that the EU is quite kind of unpredictable as an organisation, because it's just very complex. It's got lots of moving parts, really, and it's not clear how they always fit together. It's often also an organisation that's kind of formed through crisis. So the big leaps forward in integration, they don't come because a bunch of people get together and they say, well, this is my vision and let's change Europe according to this vision, and let's maybe spend a year figuring out how we should do it. That's not the way European integration moves forward. That was maybe the way 20 or 30 years ago, but it doesn't seem to be the way it happens now. Instead, the way it happens is there's a massive crisis. You know, one country invades another, there's a pandemic, there's a financial crisis, and then literally within 48 hours, some major package of reforms is announced, and it fundamentally changes the way Europe looks. And I think probably that trend will kind of continue. So, you know, Europe is not going to be, the future of Europe is not going to be formed by some kind of plan. It's going to be formed through responding to emergencies. And we don't really know what those emergencies will be, right?
Right,
you know, it could be that the US and China engage in, you know, a massive trade war, or actually an open conflict, and that will be the crisis. It could be, you know, it could be a climate catastrophe. It could be lots of other things. In terms of kind of leadership and the kind of people that we need to be engaged in European affairs, I think that's also kind of changing a little bit, and it relates to maybe some things we've already discussed. I mean, one is that sort of Europe now does everything, so it needs people with lots of different varied forms of knowledge, right? So, you know, there was a time when kind of most people who were engaged in European affairs, they were trade experts, they were competition experts, they were people who knew a lot about maybe the EU institutions and about EU law, and they had a very kind of a narrow type of training and expertise, and that expertise made them fit for working in this project and advancing this project. And I think that's not the case anymore. I think the people who work in European integration and who can effectively work either at the national level or the European level in interesting European careers, they need both a wider set of skills. So not just, for example, legal or institutional knowledge, but, you know, knowledge of statistics, knowledge of economics, geopolitical and international relations knowledge. And they also need to be policy experts, right? They need more knowledge of kind of specific policy challenges in fields like sustainability or digitalization or other fields. So I think there's kind of been a diversification in the types of skills that you need in order to be kind of successful, really, in engaging in European integration and moving European integration forward.
This sounds a little like overall it is a diversification of what is needed, of the qualities and skills needed, but like on an individual level it would be people that might have an even narrower knowledge of one specific topic. Did I understand that correctly?
Well, I think that's often the case. I mean, when I look at, for example, people at the Hertie School who, were students that I taught, for example, who've gone to work in Brussels or work in national ministries, often they've been interesting for the EU, and they've been kind of good people for the EU to hire, and they've done really great work in European institutions, not because they were kind of EU experts, but because they were experts at like specific challenges, essentially, that the EU also needs to have knowledge about, right? So in the humanitarian sector, or in the agricultural sector, or in social policy, or in climate, or in other different things. So I think that's one of the kind of new changes, is that to work in European integration, it's not that you've got to be a Europe expert. You've got to be an expert. And the Europe thing, in a way, it comes later.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe a follow-up question. If you have a lot of experts on very different topics, how do you ensure that they all can actually communicate with each other, and that there is no misunderstandings, and that the expertise they have can be communicated properly between different fields of expertise?
I suppose that's a challenge that kind of any organization has. It's also a challenge for the European Union, of course, because you have another complexity, which is that people are from different national backgrounds, and they have language barriers and they have cultural barriers that have got to be overcome. But I think there is a kind of institutional culture within the European institutions that sort of allow these institutions to work effectively. And that culture is embedded within an understanding of kind of the overall norms and values of the organization and what the organization is trying to achieve. I think it's the same at the university, where I work. I mean, we're doing very different things. Most of my colleagues are doing research many of them are doing research that I don't really understand, where I could attend a presentation and I wouldn't be able to really contribute much. But we all have a common idea of like what we're trying to do. We're trying to advance science. We're trying to teach young people. We're trying to create a respectful, open university environment where there's free exchange. And I think that kind of allows us to get along and to communicate. So obviously the EU has to work hard at embedding this kind of institutional culture as well.
Okay, that also makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that answer. Maybe back to the future leaders in the European Union. You said that usually changes in the European Union come about because of crisis, and obviously we can't really predict crisis. Maybe we can to a certain degree, but we can't really predict them. Yet there is a few ongoing issues that we're facing, like you've already mentioned, climate change or migration as a European kind of problem. The Russian invasion, for example, like all those things that we are still facing. If we're talking maybe about one of those topics, what would be like actual skills or knowledge you would need to work on one of those issues? Maybe like give us a hands-on example. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so when I think about, we have a lot of really interesting alumni at Hertie who've, I think, developed interesting careers in EU governance. And I think probably those alumni have kind of developed their own unique kind of perspectives on European integration in order for them to be successful, in order to tackle kind of some of these some of these challenges, right? So I don't know if it comes down to a particular kind of recipe or set of qualifications that you need in order to be successful. I think it's often about having a certain confidence and a certain vision in what you want to achieve. So one person that we're very proud of, for example, is Daniel Boeselager. He was one of the founders of Volt, which is a pan-European political party. He's also a Hertie alumni, and I think that's an example, right? Sort of the traditional model that I think you would follow would be you would get involved in an existing political party at the national level, and you would, if you're talking about the German SPD, you would maybe be involved in a trade union, and then you would be involved in a local chapter, and you would try to get engaged in European politics that way. But I think his idea was, well, this structure isn't working anymore, right? So why don't we think about forming a pan-European political party, which in a way, if you're a young person, is it's quite a crazy thing to do, because the chances of you actually being successful and getting MEPs into the European Parliament and getting media attention, it's an enormous challenge. So I admire those individuals and kind of the self-belief that they had in order to do that. And I think sort of what was required in that case, and also in other examples, was having a vision of what you want to achieve and really devoting your energies to achieve it in spite of all the obstacles that you might face.
Thank you for that. So you said that you admire those achievements and also all the work that came before, and you said that it was maybe a little crazy to think that as a young person you can do a pan-European party. But then also you said before that there might need to be a change with the future of governance, with the future of policy making and how to go about it. Do you feel like there is a certain, let's say, craziness needed to go about that?
I think sort of it's certainly a willingness to kind of take risks, right? I think that's why I suppose if you look at figures who have really changed history and people who've been very innovative and who've had a great impact upon society, it often is people who do that when they're quite young, or at least kind of their period where they're most impactful is their period where, let's say, they're in their 20s and in their 30s. And I say that sort of as someone who's, a bit more midlife, someone who has a family, someone who has a mortgage. I think you're probably less inclined to take risks because you have more invested. You have more other commitments. Whereas as a young person, of course, there are lots of young people who also have a lot of responsibilities, but the future is not set. It's maybe a period in which you can really, make your mark. And a period where if you fail, there's still time to start again, and there's still time to take another direction. So I think that is one of the great opportunities that kind of this generation has. Sort of, it faces a huge amount of challenges that it's inherited from the previous generation. But at the same time, sort of the very fact that it's clear that a lot of the structures that we have in our societies is not working suggests that it's also a time where we need a lot of innovation and we need a lot of ideas. And it's kind of the mantle now of this generation to take risks and come up with new ways of governing society in order that society can move forward. And many of them will not succeed, and many of them will not lead to tangible innovations, but some of them will. And I think it requires just a little bit of faith that things can change, and we know that they can.
Yeah. Yeah, history has proven.
Yeah.
So maybe to come to a close, is there a piece of advice that you would give to young people, young adults that want to have a career in policymaking in the European Union?
I'm not sure about if my advice would be a career advice. I think more a kind of an advice to young people in terms of as citizens and as Europeans, really, as people who are kind of, who want a European future, really. Like, I mean, we didn't really talk that much about kind of populism and the rise of populism. But if you look at sort of what's driving the rise of populism, both within Europe and other parts of the world, it's also, we have a kind of changing demographic profile of people who support populist groups. So to give an example, young men in particular have started supporting far-right parties in much larger numbers than they ever did before. So in a way, kind of that battle over what our constitutional democracies are going to look like and what Europe is going to look like, that's a battle being fought within the young generation that are now becoming of voting age and are starting to vote. So I think sort of that means that sort of those within the that young generation who are interested in Europe and who have a more international outlook and who want to ensure that there is a European Union in 20 years, it's about persuading and engaging with people in your generation and kind of trying to come to a collective understanding of why we need to have something like the European Union and what its goals should be. So I think sort of this is kind of my advice, is that sort of that not that young people should seek EU careers necessarily, but that young people should start talking about Europe with each other and should engage each other on the future of European integration, because we badly need it if we're going to have a European Union in 20 to 30 years.
Yeah. And we all hope that we shall have that still in 20 to 30 years. Well, then, is there anything else you might want to add, you might still want to say or to share?
No, apart from to give a bit of an open invitation. I mean, there are many listeners, I guess, who are in Berlin, who are Berlin-based. So the Jacques Delors Centre, we do a lot of activities. We have a lot of events on Europe, including public events. We do a lot of policy briefings and policy papers on kind of current issues on European integration. And we also have a Master of International Affairs that has a Europe concentration within it. So if you're a young person who's interested in studying Europe at a master's level, if you're interested in attending some of our events, or if you're interested in reading some of our publications, then I would encourage you to look at the website of the Jacques Delors Centre and get in touch with us, because we're very open and very interested in kind of getting the young community in Berlin more involved with what we do.
Thank you. And you heard the man. Well then, thank you again so much for your time and all the expertise you shared with me and with us today. And I hope you'll have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, Tavia. It was my pleasure.